As you look at this image, there are probably a number of things going through your mind, but I want to begin with just one basic question. Would it be wrong to shoot this man? Think about that for a moment. Okay, seriously though. I wanted to start off our module here today with a graphic and question to get your attention, but there is, of course, a point here. One of the things that we need to do now as we're building our understanding of natural law and Aquinas' ethics is to look at how we make moral judgments about particular acts. And obviously, one of the kinds of acts that receives a great deal of attention when it comes to moral judgment analysis is intentionally killing another person. But as with many things in connection with natural law, a lot of times we need to work through our reasoning carefully before we can jump to say what might be the obvious conclusion. So, for example, in the case of our antlered friend here, now in this particular context, in this particular setting, I think in most cases it would probably, in fact, be immoral to shoot this man, since he is running out in the open on a broad roadway. Now, why exactly he is wearing antlers on his head, I can't really provide that information for you. Perhaps some industrious Google searching might turn up some leads. But in this particular situation, shooting him would most likely be immoral. However, there could very well be situations where if this person were in fact to pause and wander off the roadway for a moment, perhaps go rest in a grove of trees, and if it were, hunting season, and there was a hunter out on private land that he'd be given permission to hunt, and he sees a head with these antlers rear up in a distant grove of trees, and he fires and shoots, well, that might lead us to a very different decision, very different conclusion about whether or not that act of shooting was moral or not. If one wears antlers on their head and wanders around the woods and hedgerows during deer season here in Kansas, that would probably not be a particularly prudent course of action. And if you were shot, it's unlikely that the authorities would press murder charges on the hunter who shot you. And this reveals quite a bit of important insight into how natural law works. And if you've gone ahead and started reading the second section in our book, this should be familiar to you. We're getting into issues of sins of ignorance or the evaluation of moral acts. And so what I want to do in this module is to introduce us to some of the ideas from this second section of the textbook. But also what I want to do here is to augment or supplement a little bit the kind of basic outline that you're getting from the textbook. Having already heard a couple comments from people, I think the textbook is fairly understandable, and I think it does a good job of laying out some of the basics. But in order to prepare us for some specific application of natural law to specific cases later in our course and in an upcoming course, we need to add a little more detail and some more contemporary natural law developments to our account, I think, to really give you a solid grounding in natural law. So what I want to do here is to cover the basic ideas touched on in that second section of the textbook, but also to bring in and supplement it with some of these more contemporary natural law developments and scholars. And here I'll be drawing from the textbook I used in the previous version of this class, William May's Introduction to Moral Theology and Natural Law, which is fairly dense and technical, so you're going to be getting some excerpts from that. But certainly, if you are interested in pursuing these ideas further, I can put a link up to the book on Blackboard, and you can certainly get that book if you are interested in it. So we will go ahead now and move on to the next page and start fleshing out our understanding of evaluation of actions using natural law theory. One of the important ideas in Aquinas' understanding of the human person and of natural law and morality that was talked about in the last section, and is also focused on here in our textbook in the second section, is the idea that human beings are always acting in pursuit of some particular end. People don't just randomly do things for no reason whatsoever. And if we do truly involuntary actions, like some sort of reflex or a sneeze or what have you, those aren't really the kinds of actions we're interested in when it comes to moral judgments. Right? We don't make moral judgments about things that aren't intentional. But for any sort of intentional act that we are going to make, or any sort of deliberate act, to use some of the language from the textbook, whenever we do a deliberate act, there is some end in mind. And again, as the book explains, when it comes to Aquinas and his understanding of human actions, his view is that we always are ultimately acting, at least indirectly, in pursuit of some ultimate good, right? That for any particular action we make, we could ask, well, why did you do that, right? And there could be a whole range of possible answers depending on the action and how deeply we're thinking about it at any given time. And it might go through several steps as we think about, okay, well, why did you eat breakfast this morning? Well, I was hungry. Well, why did you want to satisfy your hunger? Well, it's good for my health. Well, why is it important that you have good health? And so on and so forth. And so all of our actions can be subjected to that sort of analysis, and Aquinas is ultimately going to see them all as leading to seeking that ultimate end of happiness, which he's going to see as being fully realized in a personal relationship, a personal union with God, ultimately in the beatific vision. Now, one of the questions we ended up with last time on the previous module was a question of what on earth would this really look like, right? What does happiness or human flourishing really look like, right? And we could take from reading Aquinas and from the textbook this idea that it might consist of kind of sitting around in a contemplative state, just abstractly contemplating the existence of God as being itself and loving this kind of intellectual concept that we've formed of God. And I don't think that's necessarily what Aquinas is getting after, but it's a little hard to kind of flesh out the depiction we get of our ultimate end, at least insofar as the textbook is presenting Aquinas to us. And so I thought this would be one place where it might be helpful to bring in some more recent natural law scholars who are drawing on Aquinas and explicitly doing so in their work, but trying to expand on what this idea of human flourishing would look like. And so there's a whole host of natural law scholars currently and in the past generation who've done a lot of work that's interesting and important. One kind of particular group or school of thought is Grisey and Finnis and Boyle, who are a group of scholars who did quite a bit of work together, have done quite a bit of work together. I think they're all still alive. And one of the things that they've developed is an idea or a list of basic goods, right? And so when we talk about human flourishing or eudaimonia or happiness, what does that look like? Well, it's not necessarily any one particular thing. It's not just contemplation of God, in an intellectual form at least. It's not any one particular activity that, in fact, a truly flourishing life, a truly happy life, is going to consist of a number of different goods. And they argue, I think, fairly persuasively, that there are a certain number of goods where, when we're asking that question of why are you doing this or why are you doing that, there really is no other use to these goods beyond perhaps the fact that they contribute to our ultimate happiness, right? So these are kind of one step down, if you will, from our ultimate end of being truly happy, flourishing people. And to be a truly happy, flourishing person, you're going to need these different basic goods as part of your life, part of your existence. And I give you here the list of basic goods on the page that they've developed. And all of these things, I think we would agree, would go into kind of an ideal flourishing life, ideal flourishing human existence, right? And so having things like health, like friendship, like peace with our neighbor, peace of conscience, peace with God, all of these things are going to come together to produce this happy, flourishing life. Now, of course, we can just say, right, that, well, we pursue ultimate happiness, we pursue becoming like God, to be with God, but part of why it's helpful to have something like this list of basic goods is that it can give us a little more specific guidance, if you will, in thinking about how we ought to structure our lives, the kinds of things we ought to be pursuing, and also the kinds of things that we ought not to be damaging or preventing other people from attaining as well. And so having this list of basic goods can give us an image of the kind of life, the kinds of things that we ought to be pursuing for ourselves. But of course, when we're talking about moral laws, natural law, leading a good life, it's not just about ourselves, of course. We also should be working and acting to make it possible for other people to attain those basic goods as well. And so Grisey and Finnis and Boyle are going to use this list of basic goods as a kind of foundation for spelling out their contemporary account of natural law to, again, add some level of detail to Aquinas' version and argue that we can start to formulate some moral rules, some moral norms, using this list of basic goods and encouraging people and telling people to always act in a way that will help them attain these goods and that will not work against these goods. And so to explain a little bit more how that works, we will go ahead and move on now to the next page. All right, now that we have a slightly expanded account of what our ultimate aim is, both for ourselves and for other people, now we can start to talk a little bit more specifically about the rules that will help get us towards that goal. And this is really a crucial step in developing an account of natural law or a natural law based moral system, right? Because on a certain level, it would be possible to basically wrap up our study of natural law at this point. And we could just say, this is the way we should live, right? Whenever you're going to perform some sort of deliberate action, you just need to sit back and think about, is this action going to bring about or work towards my proper ultimate end or the ultimate end of other people? Or is it going to work against that, either for myself or for others? And that really, in a nutshell, is the essence of natural law theory. And we've even added a little more detail to that and say, okay, well, to help us think about what our ultimate flourishing end might be like, it's going to consist of a combination of these basic goods that all people aim for and that are good for all people. And so we need to act in ways that will promote these goods in ourselves and others. And we could just end it there. Now, the problem with doing that, of course, is that, well, for one thing, that's pretty abstract, and it might be a little difficult to explain, say, to your 6 or 7-year-old. For another reason, and connected to that, is that it would be really difficult to go through life trying to make decisions kind of solely on that foundation, right? That there's quite a bit of a leap between pursuing a person's ultimate good or flourishing and, whether or not I should go ahead and give my answers on an exam to my friend, or whether or not I need to try to find the person who maybe dropped the $20 bill I found on the sidewalk, or whatever it might be. It's going to be difficult to go through and make all the different decisions we make in a day-to-day basis, going through this really kind of abstract, fairly lengthy reasoning process every time we need to make a decision. And so to make kind of regular daily life possible, and to help avoid having to contemplate our ultimate goals in life every time we want to do something, natural law tradition has developed a whole host of principles and rules or moral norms, to be a little more jargony about it, to help us make these kinds of decisions, right? And so, as it turns out, there are some basic guidelines that we can follow that will, in most cases, lead us towards those ultimate goods, those basic goods, and our ultimate proper end of happiness. And so much of what natural law theory does in practice is think about, well, what are the specific rules that are going to give us the useful shortcuts, if you will, to deciding how to act so that we don't have to reason through the whole meaning and purpose of life every time we want to do something. And again, here I'm going to borrow a bit from William May in his account of Grisey, Finnis, and Boyle to kind of flesh this out a little bit and to supplement what we read in the chapter, right? And I think, again, the textbook does a fine job of explaining this process in Aquinas, but I think the May's account of the contemporary natural law theory also adds a little another perspective to it and kind of fleshes out the ideas a bit. And again, the textbook does a nice job of talking about how the intellect and the will work together to produce all of our different moral actions and choices, and we can get into some of that more in a little bit. But I think talking specifically about these moral norms and what they are and where they come from will help, again, flesh out the details from the book a bit. So if we're going to try to develop a series of rules or norms to guide our life according to, well, how do we do that? Well, first off, we got to start at the basics, start at the beginning. And if you were to ask, your typical Sunday school class or CCD class, what is the basic moral principle that we should follow, you might very likely get the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And of course, that is a pretty good summary of the moral life. I think a guy who said that was pretty smart and stuff. But again, it's very general, right? And so what natural law theory has done is take that basic principle and develop it and add some clarification to it, if you will, right? And so Aquinas does this himself and draws on the golden rule as a principle or first principle of morality. When we look at these modern natural law theorists, they do as well. Now you can see, right, I'm giving you here on the page Grisey and Finnis's account of the golden rule, or their version of it, and it certainly isn't quite as poetic or memorable as Jesus' version. And this is going to be something that comes up again and again when we look at natural law, right? That a lot of the moral principles and rules that we use and learn in everyday life are based in natural law, right? And the golden rule is an expression rooted in natural law. But when we're studying kind of natural law in a deliberate, scholarly or academic way, there's a need to spell things out more explicitly in more detail in order to deal with certain difficult cases. And so that's what we get here, right? In essence, what Grisey and Finnis are saying is the same thing as Jesus, but they're saying it in a much more specific way, involuntarily acting for human goods and avoiding what is opposed to them, one ought to choose and otherwise will those and only those possibilities whose willing is compatible with a will toward integral human fulfillment. Now again, certainly not poetic, but the idea is to flesh out what Jesus is really saying in the golden rule, that we always want to work for the integral good of ourselves and of others. And doing that is going to mean working for and advancing the attainment of those basic goods that we talked about and not working against them, right? And Of course, one of the things that has come very clearly in the textbook is that people, when they act wrongly, they don't tend to act wrongly because they want to be evil. They tend to act wrongly because they're pursuing some one good at the expense of others, or they're pursuing some good disproportionately, right? And again, that's what this formulation of the natural law principle or the golden rule is getting at, that we shouldn't seek some particular good in a way that compromises other goods for ourselves or for other people. So that basic first principle can then be taken and expanded on and applied to a variety of different possibilities to give us more specific guidance, right? So again, the golden rule, or even this very wordy scholarly adaptation of it, is still pretty general and going to be difficult to use as a guide for daily living. And so what Grisey and Finnis do, kind of as a next step, is to come up with these modes of responsibility, right? And so this is basically a list of things that we shouldn't do, right? Different ways that one could, in fact, violate the golden rule or this first moral principle that they've developed. And again, the language is academic and scholarly, but we can see, I think, in a number of these what the idea is, right? That we shouldn't be stopped by inertia from acting for good, right? You're being lazy and slothful, that's not going to be an excuse for not pursuing your good or the good of other people. Basically, we don't want to let our passions, we don't want to let a disordered will keep us from working for our good or the good of another person. And again, hopefully you can see how this ties in with what you've been reading in the textbook as well, right? That in the discussion of the different kinds of sins, basically Aquinas talks about different ways or different aspects of the human person that can prevent us from acting rightly. So that there can be disorders in our passions, there can be disorder in our intellect or ignorance, there can be a deliberately disordered will as well. And so these different modes of responsibility that you can see all represent kind of different ways that we could violate that first moral principle. So now these give us some more specific guidance in terms of how we should and specifically shouldn't act. And from these modes of responsibility, then, you can also develop more specific moral norms, right? And so, for example, in terms of ordering goods properly, we could talk about not pursuing one good disproportionate to another so that it interferes, or we could just say, don't steal, right? Don't steal is a nice, quick way of saying we shouldn't seek our own good to be had from the enjoyment or possession of material goods in a way that interferes with the good of another person. And again, that's going to be difficult to teach to a toddler or your elementary school kid. So instead we say, look, don't steal, don't kick, don't bite, don't lie, so on and so on and so forth. And these moral norms grow out of and express these principles of natural law that these scholars then describe in much more specific academic terms. But there's a real connection there. Right, and so this is where we're finally getting to what was probably familiar territory for most of us, right? That these moral norms that natural law theorists will talk about, these are the moral rules, the principles that we've learned since childhood and that make up our day-to-day living. And this is where we finally have some, handy guidelines, right? Should I take the candy bar from the store without paying for it? Well, I don't need to go through this reasoning process of pursuing my ultimate good or looking at some academic formulation of the first moral principle. I've just been taught since I was a kid, don't steal, or thou shalt not steal, if you went to a good King James church like I did. And so these moral norms are built on and are specific expressions of these modes of responsibility, these first principles that make up the foundations and kind of the structure of natural law. And then they find expression in everyday life in these handy moral norms. And when we look at them, we can work backward to these more fundamental academic principles, right? Well, why shouldn't we steal? Well, we shouldn't steal because, look, you might get some good from the thing you took, you might get some pleasure from it, but it's going to undermine other goods. It's going to undermine the good of the storekeeper who needs to make a living to provide for his family. It's going to undermine my peace of conscience. It might undermine my relationship with the storekeeper and with other people if they found out. And so we could turn around and take, don't steal or thou shalt not steal, and then spell it out in these more specific ways. And this is, again, getting at one of the reasons why it's helpful to actually go through kind of a formal study of ethics or of natural law in particular. Because one of the things that we will see as we work through the class is that, yes, in 90 or 99% of the cases, these basic principles that we've been taught from childhood are going to give us the right answer, right? Don't steal, don't lie, don't kill, all of these sorts of things. However, there are going to be complicated cases, right? There are cases where there are relatively new kinds of actions, right? Should I download music from the internet without paying for it? Should we support in vitro fertilization? Should we promote therapeutic cloning? Should we support research in producing clinical immortality? Right? These are not questions where there's a quick and easy kind of 10 Commandments way of dealing with it, or something my grandpa taught me back at the old fishing hole. Right? There are these new complex situations where we need to have access to this more formal way of reasoning about right and wrong that kind of a formal study of natural law provides. There are also sort of extreme situations, right? Well, yes, normally one should not take a candy bar from a store without paying for it. But let's suppose, I'm living in the midst of a famine, and all kinds of things are going wrong, and I need this candy bar in order for someone to survive, and the credit card machine isn't working. Can I take it? And we can talk more about that in a little bit. But there can be situations where, given the circumstances, the quick and easy or handy moral norm isn't going to be specific enough for us to work out the right thing to do. So then it's going to be helpful to be able to take a step back and say, okay, what does the moral norm, thou shalt not steal, really express? If we really want to get into detail about why we should not steal, what does that mean? Then we can go back to these modes of responsibility and these other components of natural law to work out answers to tough cases. And so we'll, again, talk about that more in a little bit. What I want to do now, before we do that, though, is to take a moment here and shift from looking at kind of how we develop the rules from the foundations to the specific moral norms, and turn and look at how we make moral judgments of specific actions. Now that we've developed or talked about how moral rules or moral norms grow out of the foundations of natural law theory and out of the foundations of a Christian worldview and understanding of the human person, how do we take those rules then and turn around and make judgments about particular actions or particular choices? And that's one of the focuses of this section in our textbook, and also is obviously a key component of natural law in general, and is something that contemporary natural law theorists have dealt with as well. And again, I think the textbook does a pretty good job of talking about how this works. When we are making judgments about actions, of course, we're only really concerned with deliberate actions, actions where people have chosen to do a particular thing freely and deliberately. And also, right, when we are making judgments about actions, as the examples of accidentally shooting terrorists and things like that comes up in our textbook, right, that when we're making judgments about actions, we're focusing on actions that are freely and deliberately done, and actions that are knowingly done, right? So we really judge actions based on what a person could reasonably be expected to know, right? So, for example, as the textbook talks about, somebody who randomly goes into the mall and shoots somebody, and it turns out to have been a terrorist who is going to blow the place up, their action is still not a good one, right? Because we don't judge them based on something they couldn't possibly have known, namely that the random person that they shot was in fact a terrorist. Or the same goes for the guy starting his car and blowing somebody else up. We don't judge that as wrong because there's no reasonable way that person could be expected to know that was going to happen. And so again, to get to kind of the contemporary, more technical approach to things, right? When we judge an action, any moral act is made up of three parts, right? There is the object, the intention, and the circumstances. And this is brought up as well in the textbook. Now, there are a couple things to clarify here. Right? When we're judging an action, we need to look at all of these different things. And if we're going to reach the conclusion that an act is a good act, it needs to be good in consideration of all three of these different components of the act. So if one of them is bad, one of them is wrong, then that's going to make the whole action wrong. So for example, you can do something that's basically good, the object can be good, the circumstances you do it in are fine, it's good. But if your intention is to, get people to like you so that you can ultimately take over the universe, that makes the otherwise good action bad, right? And so we could do that with any of these. If any of them is wrong or bad, it makes the whole act wrong. Another thing to clarify here at the outset is that it can be a little confusing when we look at this breakdown of an act and see object, intention, and circumstances. When we say object, the object of the act, this isn't just what happens. This isn't just kind of a physical account of what action took place, right? When we talk about this object in a moral or natural law sense, it's really the act as intended, right? So there's, and this is why it's a little confusing, right? This object piece of the puzzle contains a little bit of intention in it, right? So the second piece there, intention, is more kind of what are your goals in doing this action, and this can be medium term and long term. When we talk about the act as intended making up the object, this is kind of the action as the person doing it understands it, right? So for example, cutting off an arm, right? If you just say cutting off an arm, that really isn't a sufficient description of the act to be the object, right? We need to know a little bit more about the nature of the act to be able to evaluate it, right? So now if we're cutting off an arm to save a person's life, well, look, that is an act, that is an object that we can make a judgment of. So we're cutting off an arm that is gangrenous, right? That would be an object here, right? And our intention is to save this person's life, so that they can go on to live long, happy, productive lives and make the world a better place, and yada. We can expand on that intention part as well there. Now there could be other situations where cutting off an arm is a different act. It's a different object, if you will. So if you're cutting off an arm as part of a torture of someone, that's not just a different intention, that is really a different act. That's a different object. So when we talk about the object, it's the act as intended or the act as understood by the person performing it. Or to go back to our opening page there, right? Shooting someone is really not even a sufficient description of an act to be an object here in our analysis, right? Intentionally shooting an innocent person, that is an object. Or shooting what appears to be a deer legally during hunting season, that is an object, right? Now in that case, the circumstance turns out to be, well, in fact, it turned out to be a guy wearing an antler helmet who was wandering around in the woods. But the basic object of the act that we're looking at here is not immoral, right? Whereas intentionally shooting an innocent person, is a different act because it's understood and intended differently at the outset. So hopefully that makes a little sense. So when we are looking at judging an action, we need all three pieces to make our judgment, right? We need to have the act as intended by the agent, we need their intention in carrying out this act, and we need to know the circumstances, right? And so if all of those are good, the act is good, right? And for all of those being good and the act being good, that's going to be another way of saying that this action in these circumstances with this intention is going to move us and other people towards our ultimate goal. It's going to help us attain those basic goods or help other people attain those basic goods, right? And an action that is not good in its object or in its intention or in its circumstances is an action that's not going to help us reach that end, attain those basic goods, or is going to deliberately work against our own basic goods or the basic goods of another person. So looking at the object, the intention, and the circumstances is going to help us decide whether an action is getting us towards those basic goods or moving away or working against them. And that's really how the analysis of a moral act happens in natural law. And we'll see a lot of examples of this as we go through the course, but it's important here at the beginning to just have that sort of terminology in mind of the object of an act, the intention, and the circumstances, because all of those things will become important here. Now, to talk about a little more why these are important and why in particular circumstances and intention are an important part of this picture, let's go ahead and move now to the next page. Now, one question that might come to mind is why do intentions and circumstances matter so much? Right? One of the distinctive features of natural law theory is that it's not consequentialist, right? So there are a lot of ethical systems that are consequentialist ethical systems, and we'll talk more about this a little later in the class. But utilitarianism is the most prominent example, right? Which is going to say that actions are right or wrong based on the consequences they produce. So if it makes a lot of people happy and not many people sad, good. Vice versa, bad, right? And natural law is often talked about and often promoted in large part by being the opposite of that, right? That it's not about the consequences, it's not about judging individual acts based on the circumstances, it's about whether an act in and of itself is right or wrong. And so it might seem, given that understanding of natural law, a little weird to include circumstances and intention in our basic criteria for judging moral acts. Why are they so important? Well, they are important because in some cases, right, the intentions or the circumstances can really change the overall moral value of the action. Right. So again, in the example of our antler-wearing friend, the circumstances can make a big difference. Is he out in the middle of the road and you shoot him because you're outraged by his ridiculous fashion sense, or is he, hiding in the bushes and you honestly thought he was a deer? Right. The circumstances of where he is really matters. Right. And your intentions matter too. If you are shooting him because you just can't handle his fashion sense, that's not so good. If you're shooting him because, he's about to go gore some school children with his antlers, that would be a very different intention, and it produce a different judgment of the act. Now, one of the other reasons that intention and circumstances matter in terms of moral judgment is when it comes to making judgments about wrong acts, right? And so one of our chapters in this section of the textbook looks at different ways of sinning. Now, admittedly, the chapter is not quite as exciting as it could be for a chapter that's about different ways of sinning. It's a little dry, but in all seriousness, given the natural law understanding of the person and of how morality works, there are in fact different ways that people can sin. Now, an important thing to say here at the beginning is that this is not to say that, well, if in certain circumstances or with certain intentions, something that's really objectively wrong becomes right. Right? This is not relativism. This is not something we'll look at next time, proportionalism. This is still natural law. This is still based on the idea that certain actions are right or wrong. But even when somebody does something that we can say, yep, that is a wrong action, that is an action that's working against their ultimate good or against the ultimate good of another person, that's not the end of our moral judgment in many cases. We also then need to think about their moral responsibility or their culpability, right? So think about, well, why is this particular action wrong? Are there features of this action that increase or decrease the person's culpability, right? So there are, again, as the textbook talks about, different ways of sinning, right? There are sins of ignorance, where there's some defect in our intellect and our understanding of a situation that can lead us to act wrongly. And so, as it talks about there, right, unintentional ignorance where we couldn't be expected to know what we would need to know to act rightly, that's going to produce a decrease in our moral responsibility, right? There's no reason for me to suspect that the antlers that I see in the hedgerow are in fact attached to some dude as opposed to a deer. Now, if I lived next door to this guy for 20 years and I had seen this bozo, running around the neighborhood with these antlers strapped to his head every morning for 20 years, and then if I went in the backyard and saw some antlers in the hedgerow and didn't look very carefully before I fired at that deer, that would be a different kind of ignorance, right? That I should reasonably be expected in that situation to have known or to make certain that I knew whether or not it was really a deer or my crazy neighbor before I fired. Right, and that would be an instance where even if I didn't really know on that given morning who it was, given what had come before, I should be expected to take that extra step and find out, given my understanding of the situation. And again, this would be where intention and circumstances are going to come into play. In that case, the circumstances are going to increase my culpability. We can also look at cases where intentions will matter, right? So let's say somebody donates, $1 million to a local children's hospital, right? This is the object here is clearly good. The circumstances could be good. They really need it. I've got some extra money. Circumstances all work out. But again, if the intention is purely to make myself look good, I could care less about little kids, but I hired a PR guy and I was trying to decide whether I should build, a giant bust of myself in the town square or give the money to the children's hospital. And he told me that people would be more impressed if I gave money to the children's hospital. And if that was the basis for my judgment, what would otherwise be a moral act, in fact, can become an immoral one based on my intention, that my goal is not in any way to help children. My goal is, in fact, to aggrandize myself and feed my huge ego. In that case, what would otherwise be a moral act becomes immoral based on my intentions, right? And so, again, we want to make sure when we talk about this to not give the impression that natural law is all about our intentions and the circumstances. But at the same time, those things do matter, right? And they do help us think through, again, whether these specific actions are actions where we are working toward our true good or the good of other people or working against it. And this breaking down of the act into object, intention, and circumstances can be helpful in making those sorts of decisions. And again, just in terms of presenting this material as teachers or as catechists, one of the things that I've often encountered in the classroom is that when you present natural law, it can seem pretty harsh, pretty demanding, particularly when you get on to talk about some of the specific teachings when it comes to sexual ethics or medical ethics or whatever it might be. A lot of people can find it very difficult to accept, because it is going to say, look, there are certain actions that are right or wrong. Even if a person's life is at stake, you cannot do this because it is just a wrong act. And I think it's important to make sure that we talk about the issue of culpability as well, right? To say that there are these extreme circumstances, and natural law is going to say, even in extreme circumstances, there are certain actions that you cannot do. However, right, when it comes to talking about, making judgments about people in extreme circumstances, that needs to be considered, and their culpability can be reduced, if not nearly eliminated, in some circumstances, right? So that people who are fighting desperately to save a child's life need to be judged with those circumstances, with that intention in mind, right? And this is, again, not just a cop-out to making people feel good. This, in fact, of course, has parallels in church discipline as well, right? That when we commit a mortal sin, it's not a mortal sin if it is not done freely and deliberately and knowingly. Ignorance, compulsion, and these sorts of things can, in fact, have an impact on whether or not the church would deem something a mortal sin or not. And the same thing we find in natural law as well. So I think it's important to make sure that however you present natural law yourselves or think about it, whether it's in a classroom or just talking with people, to make sure to include this understanding of how intentions and circumstances can reduce people's culpability in order to not make natural law seem like this harsh, unbending approach to life. All right, so we will leave that for the moment, and again, I'm sure clarify many of those things as we go through the course and look at specific issues and examples. To wrap up our module here on moral norms and moral acts, I thought it might be helpful to take a moment and talk about two examples that I often use in class to just give more examples of how this works, and also to talk a little bit about how natural law relates to, say, the Ten Commandments, or relates to biblical moral laws in general. And again, if you're working with people who are coming from Protestant tradition, or really even many Catholics, they're not going to be familiar with natural law, and it might very well seem to people, well, why do we need natural law? Why do we need to study this? Why do we need all this stuff? We just have the Bible, right? We have the Ten Commandments. We have all the other rules that we can find in the Bible. Why isn't that sufficient? Why do we need all this modes of responsibility and acts judged by object, intention, and circumstances? We can just read, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, etc. Well, there are a number of ways to address that. One of the things is just to point out that in many cases people don't really understand the laws as well as they should, right? Thou shalt not kill, for example, really means more accurately thou shalt not murder, right? It is, and from a natural law perspective, we would say, well, what we're really talking about here is that you shouldn't intentionally kill an innocent person, which is, again, going back to some of those basic first principles, right? That life and health are some of the basic goods, and we should never intentionally work against them in ourselves or in other people. And I guess this would be a good point to mention. It hasn't come up really in our textbook, but there are a couple of ways of putting some of the first principles of natural law that can be helpful. One of them is, to always seek the good and avoid evil. which I think maybe the textbook has mentioned. But more specifically, when we're talking about human actions, it can also often be possible to teach people the principle of, right, we should never treat a person as a means to an end, right? We should never reduce a person to an object. We always need to treat them as an end, treat them as a person in their own right. And again, another way perhaps of putting the golden rule, but it also captures another kind of nuance of it in the idea that we can't ever just treat somebody as something that's in the way of something else that we want to get. And an extension of that is that we should never intentionally harm an innocent human person, right? And so that is perhaps a more formal natural law way of putting what's really the essence of thou shalt not kill, right? We should never intentionally harm an innocent human person. But if you were going to translate that back, intentionally harming or killing, in this case, an innocent human person, we don't just call killing, we call that murder, right? And obviously, the author of the Pentateuch would have been a bit schizophrenic if they really meant thou shalt not ever kill there, and then turned around in the space of a few verses or chapters to give a whole list of commandments for applying capital punishment to a different types of wrongdoing. So obviously it doesn't mean thou shalt not kill in general. It means thou shalt not murder, or as natural law would put it, thou shalt not intentionally harm another innocent human person. There are other ways that we could show the same aspect of the Ten Commandments and the same importance of having natural law in difficult cases. So, for example, one of the examples I trot out in class typically is thou shalt not bear false witness. Thou shalt not lie. Right? Well, yes. Again, in 99% of cases, this is handy. This is a good guide for moral behavior. But not necessarily always, or at least it can be difficult to understand what it means in extreme cases, right? And from a natural law perspective, how would they parse this? How would they specify concretely what the principle is here? Well, the concrete principle here, as natural law would put it, is that we should never intentionally mislead someone who has a reasonable expectation of the truth. In most cases, this is going to mean don't lie, because most of the time when we're talking with people, people expect us to be honest with them. However, there can be extreme circumstances, right? So, for example, if I'm playing poker, right, and I tell you, you better fold now, I have a full house, right? In that situation, you don't have a reasonable expectation that I'm telling you the truth, because we both know we are playing poker, and we both know a central part of playing poker is bluffing, right? And so, in that situation, if it turns out I don't have a full house and you folded and I get the pot, you can't be upset at me, you can't say that I lied to you, because in that situation you don't have a reasonable expectation of the truth. And I'm not working against your ultimate good as a person, because we're both agreeing to play this game together, and we should both reasonably expect the other person to know how the game works, right? The classic example of this, of course, is when the Nazis come and knock on the door and ask, are you hiding any Jews in the attic during the Holocaust? Right? Well, in this situation, even if I am, many, if not all, natural law theorists would argue that in this situation, the people asking the question don't have a reasonable expectation of the truth. Right? We both know that what they are doing, or should know that what they are doing, is immoral, and that I should be working against them. Therefore, I can say nope, even if I am, because in that situation, they don't have a reasonable expectation to receive the truth from me, right? If my neighbor comes over and has like a crazy look in his eye and is like twitching and flipping out and holding an axe and asks me if I've seen his wife, in that situation, even if I've seen his wife just a moment ago and she's in my backyard, he doesn't have a reasonable expectation of me telling him the truth, because obviously in this situation it seems I should not. So again, hopefully that shows, right, thou shalt not bear false witness, or thou shalt not lie, is a good, useful moral norm. But having the more developed understanding of natural law and even these fairly wordy, academic sounding principles or modes of responsibility can be helpful in working out what we should do in difficult cases. As a side note, this is also a very important principle to have in mind when asked difficult questions by friends and relatives. So, for example, your great aunt made a casserole and she thinks it's the greatest thing ever and you think it tastes just terrible, and she asks you, oh, how was the casserole? Again, this is a place where perhaps thou shalt not bear false witness. It needs to be nuanced a bit, right? That when your great aunt asks you that kind of question, she's not really expecting a purely critical, detailed breakdown of her gastronomical failings. She really just wants you to say, yeah, great, thanks, aunt, that was wonderful. And then you just move on, right? Or if somebody asks you, do these pants make me look fat? Well, now look, if this is, in fact, your best friend and she has invited you over to ask your sincere advice because she really wants to look good for a job interview, that's one particular situation where she does have a reasonable expectation of the truth, although you should prudently put it as politely as possible. However, again, if your friend asks you this out in the middle of a party and it's just part of, your banter, when people ask those kinds of questions, they don't have a reasonable expectation of getting a true objective answer. So I'll give you that one. I think it might come in handy, at least in many of our lives. And you probably already knew it implicitly, right? Again, part of what studying morality and studying natural law is about formally talking about and working through things that we already kind of know. Another example that we could use, thou shalt not steal, right? Again, this seems very straightforward. Look, you shouldn't take something that belongs to another person without their consent or against their will. Again, yes, a pretty handy principle in 99% of cases. But what do we do, for example, in a situation where there's a famine going on and you have a rich warlord who has a warehouse full of bread and he's charging exorbitant prices for it, which he knows most people can't afford, and he's watching them literally starve to death out his window while all the bread remains locked up in a warehouse. What can we do here? Well, now look, many people in your typical classroom might very well say, well, look, even though it's wrong to steal, those people can break in and take that bread because they're starving to death. Which is an insight heading in the right direction from a natural law perspective. But it's important to say here, no, right? What natural law never says is this is wrong, but in this situation you can do it, right? So what natural law will always say, we need to do good and avoid evil, right? So if something is truly wrong, there's never a situation where, okay, that's the okay thing to do in this situation, right? Now that's not to say that in this situation, what these people need to do is starve to death in front of the warehouse full of food. What's called for here is a deeper reflection on the moral principles at work, right? And what does thou shalt not steal really mean if we're going to break it down in kind of natural law terms? Well, right, what it means is that we should not seek our own good of gaining material things in a way that undermines the good of another person by depriving them of what they need, of what is rightfully theirs. Now, when we look at this situation, the miser and the starving people, in this case, right, the miser's ownership of that bread is in fact not contributing to his ultimate good. His possession of that bread is not helping him become a truly happy person in the natural law sense. And in fact, it's working against his true good. And so what natural law would say is, yes, natural law affirms the right to private property. We will get to that in the discussion of economics in due course. But it doesn't affirm an unlimited right to private property. It says you have a right to private property insofar as it advances your own true good and doesn't undermine the true good of others. However, in this case, his possession of the bread is in fact undermining the true good of others and is undermining his own true good So he doesn't, in fact, in that situation, have a real right to that bread. So the people can break in and take that bread, but in this situation they are not, in fact, stealing, because stealing is by definition taking something that rightly belongs to another. But in this situation, the bread does not rightly belong to the miser. He doesn't have a true moral right to that bread in that situation. Again, moral norms, the Ten Commandments, good, important, useful expressions of the natural law. But the study of natural law is also still helpful and important in dealing with a lot of complex cases and issues. We will conclude things there for today, and we will go on to expand our understanding of natural law and the norms and moral rules and some of the criticisms of natural law next time in our next module.